The Arizona sun hung like a merciless bronze coin in the cloudless sky, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of red earth and scattered sagebrush. Ethan McGraw pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes as he guided his horse, Thunder, along the winding trail that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Dust clung to everything, his clothes, his skin, the worn leather of his saddle. It had been 3 days since he'd left the last town, a forgettable place called Copper Creek, where the whiskey was watered down and the locals asked too many questions. Ethan preferred the silence of the desert to the noise of civilization. His horse's hooves struck a steady rhythm against the hardpan, the only sound breaking the vast quiet except for the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Ethan's hand rested naturally on the grip of his Colt 45, a habit born from years of surviving in a land where trust was a luxury few could afford. The cowboy was a man carved by the desert itself, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin stretched, taut over sharp cheekbones. His blue eyes, pale as winter ice, missed nothing as they scanned the horizon. Those who'd crossed his path spoke of Ethan McGraw in hushed tones, not because he was cruel, but because he was efficient. When trouble found him, it ended quickly and decisively. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Ethan noticed a thin column of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the fading light. Campfire smoke meant people, and people usually meant complications, but his water was running low and his horse needed rest. Against his better judgment, he turned Thunder toward the source of the smoke. The terrain grew rougher as they approached, with red sandstone formations jutting up like ancient monuments. The smoke was coming from a small canyon hidden between 2 towering rock walls. Ethan dismounted and led his horse the final 100 yards on foot, his boots silent on the sandy ground. What he saw when he reached the canyon's edge made his blood run cold. 3 men sat around a crackling campfire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. But it wasn't the outlaws that caught Ethan's attention. It was the young Apache woman bound to a dead cottonwood tree at the edge of their camp. Even from his hidden position, Ethan could see the defiance burning in her dark eyes. She was perhaps 25, with long black hair that caught the firelight and traditional Apache dress that had been torn during her capture. Despite her bonds, she held herself with unmistakable dignity and strength. "She ain't said a word yet, Jeb," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. He was a thin man with nervous hands that couldn't seem to stay still. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut your mouth, Pike," came the sharp reply from a man with graying hair and cold, calculating eyes. This had to be Jeb Collins, the leader Ethan had heard whispered about in saloons from here to New Mexico. Collins was wanted for robbery, murder, and worse. "She'll talk eventually. They all do." The third man, heavy-set with a cruel laugh, took a long drink from a bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What if she don't, Jeb? Can't keep dragging her around forever." Collins stood and walked over to the bound woman, his spurs jingling softly with each step. "You hear that? Apache, my friend Garrett here thinks you're more trouble than you're worth." He grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. "Where's the rest of your tribe hiding?" The woman said nothing, but Ethan saw her jaw clench with determination. Collins backhanded her across the face, and she turned her head with the blow, but made no sound. Ethan had seen enough. He'd spent most of his adult life minding his own business, staying out of other people's troubles. But there were lines even a drifter wouldn't cross, and what he was witnessing crossed every one of them. Moving silently, he worked his way around the canyon rim until he found a narrow path that led down to the canyon floor. The outlaws had chosen their campsite poorly. There was only one way out, and Ethan was about to block it. He checked his weapons, the Colt 45 on his hip, a Winchester rifle slung across his back, and a sharp knife in his boot. 3 men against 1 wasn't ideal odds, but Ethan had faced worse. The desert evening was settling in, painting the sky deep purple and orange. Soon it would be dark, and darkness was a friend to those who knew how to use it. Ethan waited until full darkness had settled over the canyon like a heavy blanket. The outlaws had grown careless, with drink and overconfidence, their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they laughed and cursed around their fire. "Time to make our move, Thunder," Ethan whispered to his horse, which he'd positioned at the canyon's only exit. The animal seemed to understand, standing perfectly still and alert. Moving like a shadow, Ethan crept closer to the camp. The Apache woman had been left tied to the tree while the 3 men continued drinking. Her eyes were closed, but Ethan could tell she wasn't sleeping. She was waiting just as he was. Collins was telling a story about a bank job in Tucson when Ethan stepped into the circle of firelight, his Colt drawn and steady. "Evening, gentlemen," he said quietly. The 3 outlaws scrambled for their weapons, but Ethan was already moving. His first shot took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the darkness. Garrett managed to clear leather, but Ethan's second shot caught him center mass, and he crumpled to the ground. Collins was faster than his companions, rolling behind a large rock and returning fire. His bullet whistled past Ethan's ear as the cowboy dove for cover behind the dead cottonwood tree where the woman was bound. "Cut me loose," she whispered urgently in accented English. "I can fight." Without taking his eyes off Collins's position, Ethan drew his knife and sliced through her bonds with a quick motion. The woman immediately grabbed Pike's dropped revolver, checking its cylinder with practiced efficiency. "Who are you?" she asked, positioning herself behind the tree's thick trunk. "Name's Ethan McGraw," he replied, then raised his voice toward Collins. "Jeb, you're outnumbered now. Might want to consider surrender." Collins' laugh echoed harshly off the canyon walls. "McGraw, heard of you. They say you're fast, but they also say you mind your own business. What's your interest in this squaw?" The woman's eyes flashed dangerously at the slur, and she fired 2 quick shots toward Collins's position. Rock chips flew as her bullets struck close to their target. "Seems like my business now," Ethan called back. He studied the outlaw's position, calculating angles and timing. Collins was well protected, but the fire was between them, and the smoke was beginning to drift in the still air. "My name is Aiyana," the woman said quietly, reloading the revolver. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "Well, Aiyana," Ethan said, "how good are you with that gun?" A slight smile crossed her lips. "Good enough." The standoff continued as the moon rose full and blood-red over the canyon. Collins had gone quiet, but Ethan knew better than to assume the outlaw had given up. Men like Collins didn't surrender. They fought until they couldn't fight anymore. "There's something you should know," Aiyana whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Collins and his men, they attacked my tribe's camp 3 days ago, killed many good people. I'm the only one who escaped, and only because I was gathering medicine plants in the hills." Ethan felt a cold anger building in his chest. He'd heard rumors of Apache camps being raided, but the army usually blamed it on rogue bands of cavalry or desperate settlers. The idea that organized outlaws were systematically hunting peaceful tribes made his jaw clench. They wanted information about other bands, places where people might be hiding gold or supplies, she continued. "Collins thinks all Apache know where Spanish treasure is buried." A sound from Pike, who was still alive and moaning softly, caught their attention. The thin outlaw was trying to crawl toward his gun, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. "Stay down, Pike," Ethan warned. "You've lost enough blood already." But Collins had been waiting for just such a distraction. He made his move, sprinting, from behind his rock cover toward a cluster of boulders closer to the canyon exit. Ethan's shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling, but the outlaw kept moving. "He's trying to reach his horse," Aiyana observed, tracking Collins with her borrowed revolver. Not if I can help it, Ethan replied. He vaulted over their makeshift barricade and pursued Collins through the maze of rocks and shadows. Behind him, he heard Aiyana following, her moccasined feet silent on the sandy ground. Collins had reached his horse and was struggling to mount with his wounded leg when Ethan rounded the final boulder. The outlaw's hand was on his rifle scabbard when Ethan's voice stopped him cold. "Don't," Ethan said simply, his Colt trained on Collins's chest. Collins slowly raised his hands, but his eyes held no surrender, only the calculating look of a man planning his next move. "You made a mistake, McGraw," Collins said, his voice tight with pain. "I got friends, lots of them. They'll hunt you down like a rabid dog." "Maybe," Ethan acknowledged, "but you won't be there to see it." By the time the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn, it was over. Collins and Garrett were dead, and Pike, though wounded, would live to face whatever justice the territorial marshal decided to mete out. Ethan had tied Pike to his own horse and gathered the outlaws, weapons and supplies. There was a small bounty on Collins. Not much, but enough to buy provisions in the next town. Aiyana stood at the canyon's edge, looking out toward the rising sun. She'd found some of her personal belongings among the outlaws' gear, including a beautifully crafted knife and a small pouch containing what appeared to be medicinal herbs. "Where will you go now?" Ethan asked, approaching her carefully. Despite fighting beside him, he knew she had little reason to trust any white man, given what had happened to her people. "My tribe scattered when Collins attacked," she said without turning around. "Some went north toward the mountains, others south into Mexico. I need to find them, let them know what happened here." Ethan nodded, understanding. Family was important, maybe the most important thing there was. He'd forgotten that somewhere along his years of drifting. "The nearest town is Dry Creek, about 2 days' ride east," he offered. "I could escort you that far, make sure you get proper supplies for your journey." Now she did turn to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face for hidden motives. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." It was a fair question, and Ethan found himself without an easy answer. Something about Aiyana's courage, her dignity in the face of terror, had touched something in him that he'd thought was long dead. "Maybe because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and maybe because I've been riding alone too long." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "You saved my life, Ethan McGraw. Among my people, that creates a bond." "What kind of bond?" "The kind that says our paths are meant to cross again," she replied, "even if we don't know why yet." As the sun climbed higher, burning away the desert chill, they prepared to leave the canyon. Ethan loaded Pike onto his horse, while Aiyana gathered what remained of the outlaws' supplies that might be useful. The desert stretched endlessly before them, red earth and blue sky meeting at a horizon that seemed to promise both hope and hardship. In equal measure, the journey to Dry Creek proved harder than Ethan had expected. Pike's wound had festered, and the man was delirious with fever by the end of the first day. They had to stop frequently to give him water and check his bandages, slowing their progress across the unforgiving landscape. Aiyana proved to be an invaluable traveling companion. Her knowledge of desert plants and their medicinal properties and kept Pike alive when Ethan's rough frontier doctoring wasn't enough. She also had an uncanny ability to find water in places where Ethan saw only barren rock and sand. "There," she said on the morning of the second day, pointing to what appeared to be an unremarkable cluster of rocks. "Water." Ethan was skeptical, but when they investigated, they found a small spring hidden in the rock's shadow, its water clear and cool, despite the growing heat of the day. "How did you know?" he asked as they filled their canteens. "The desert speaks to those who listen," she replied, then smiled at his confused expression. "Also, the rocks are stained darker there, and I could smell the moisture." They were sharing the shade of a large boulder during the midday heat when Aiyana asked the question Ethan had been dreading. "What will you do after we reach Dry Creek?" He'd been asking himself the same thing. His original plan had been simple: drop off Pike, collect the bounty on Collins, and continue drifting. But something had changed during these 2 days on the trail. The easy companionship, the shared dangers and small triumphs had awakened something in him that he'd forgotten existed. "I don't know," he admitted. "Been drifting for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." "Why did you start drifting?" It was a personal question, but somehow it didn't feel invasive coming from her. Maybe it was because she'd trusted him with her own story, or maybe it was because the desert had a way of stripping away pretense. "Had a ranch once," he said, surprised at how easily the words came. "Small spread in Texas. Was going to marry a girl named Sarah, start a family." He paused, watching heat waves dance across the distant mesas. "Comanche raid took it all. Sarah, the ranch hands, even the horses. I was in town buying supplies." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment. "And you've been running from that day ever since?" "Wouldn't call it running," Ethan said. But even as he spoke, he knew she was right. "Among my people, we believe the spirits of those we've lost journey to the next world, but they cannot rest if those who loved them cannot let them go," she said gently. "Maybe Sarah's spirit has been waiting for you to stop running so she can complete her journey." It was a thought that had never occurred to Ethan, and it hit him like a physical blow. Had his grief been keeping Sarah trapped somehow? Was his endless wandering hurting the one person he'd most wanted to protect? Dry Creek was barely worthy of the name town. A dozen ramshackle buildings clustered around a single dusty street, with a saloon, a general store, and a building that served as both jail and marshal's office. The creek that had given the settlement its name had dried up years ago, leaving only a sandy depression that filled briefly during rare desert storms. Marshal Tom Bradley was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier justice to recognize the real thing when it walked into his office. He listened to Ethan's account of the fight in the canyon, examined Pike's wounds, and nodded grimly. "Collins has been a problem for months," Bradley said, filling out the necessary paperwork. "Him and his gang hit 3 settlements between here and Phoenix. Good work, McGraw." The bounty on Collins was $50, enough to keep Ethan supplied for weeks, but as he pocketed the money, he found himself thinking not about where he'd ride next, but about Aiyana's plans to find her scattered tribe. She'd purchased supplies from the general store and was preparing to head south toward the Mexican border, where she hoped to find relatives who might know where her people had gone. "It's dangerous country," Ethan warned, as they stood outside the store. "Lot of rough men between here and the border." "I've survived this long," she replied, but he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Traveling alone through outlaw territory was risky for anyone, but a young Apache woman would be particularly vulnerable. "Could use a guide," he said casually, as if the idea had just occurred to him. "Someone who knows the country." She studied his face carefully. "I thought you were a drifter. Don't drifters usually drift alone?" "Usually," he admitted. "But maybe it's time I tried something different." The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise breaking over the desert. "In that case, Ethan McGraw, I would be honored to have your company." They left Dry Creek the next morning, riding south into country that grew more dangerous with each mile. But for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't running from something. He was riding toward something, even if he wasn't entirely sure what it was. 3 days south of Dry Creek, they encountered their first real test. Smoke was rising from what appeared to be a small ranch in the distance, black columns against the azure sky that spoke of destruction and violence. "Could be a controlled burn," Ethan said, but his hand was already moving toward his rifle. "No," Aiyana replied, her voice tight with certainty. "That's not crop smoke, that's buildings." They approached carefully, using the rolling terrain for cover. What they found when they crested the final hill made Ethan curse under his breath. The ranch house was a burned shell, its roof collapsed and walls blackened. Several bodies lay scattered in the yard, and vultures were already beginning to circle overhead. "Stay here," Ethan told Aiyana, but she was already dismounting. "We need to check for survivors," she said firmly, "and the dead deserve proper respect." They found the rancher and his wife near the front door, apparently caught trying to flee the flames. An older man, probably the rancher's father, had made it to the barn before being gunned down. But there was no sign of children, though children's clothes hung on a line behind the house. "Tracks lead that way," Aiyana said, pointing toward a cluster of rocks about a quarter-mile from the ranch. "Small feet running." They followed the trail carefully, calling out softly to avoid frightening anyone who might be hiding. Behind the rocks, they found a root cellar partially hidden by brush. The door was barred from inside. "Hello?" Ethan called gently. "We're here to help." After a long moment, a small voice answered. "Papa said not to come out until he called." "I'm sorry, son," Ethan said, his throat tight. "Your papa can't call right now, but we're friends. We want to help you." It took another 10 minutes of gentle coaxing before the cellar door opened and 2 children emerged. A boy of about 8 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. They were filthy and terrified, clutching each other with desperate intensity. "What happened here?" Ethan asked the boy once they'd gotten some water and food into the children. "Bad men came," the boy said, his voice hollow with shock. "Mama hid us in the cellar, told us not to come out no matter what. They burned everything." "Did you see the men? Can you tell us anything about them?" The boy nodded reluctantly. "One of them had a scar here," he said, drawing a line across his cheek, "and he wore a Mexican hat with silver on it. He laughed when they started the fire." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that description. Santiago Vega, a half-Mexican outlaw who ran with a gang of murderers and thieves along the border. If Vega was operating this far north, it meant trouble for every honest person in the territory. "We need to get these children to safety," Aiyana said quietly. "Nearest town is Copper Creek, 2 days north," Ethan replied. "But that means backtracking, and Vega's gang could still be in the area. Then we make sure they're not," Aiyana said, her dark eyes hard as flint. They buried the family that afternoon, marking the graves with stones and the few words Ethan remembered from his mother's Bible readings. The children watched silently, still too shocked to fully understand that their old life was over forever. As evening approached, Ethan faced a dilemma. The smart thing would be to head north immediately, get the children to safety in Copper Creek. But Vega's gang was still out there, and they'd likely hit other isolated ranches before moving on. How many more families would die while he played it safe? "You're thinking of going after them," Aiyana observed as they made camp in a hidden arroyo several miles from the burned ranch. "Somebody has to," Ethan replied. "These children have relatives. In Copper Creek, the boy told me about an uncle who runs the livery stable. They'd be safe there. And you think you can take on Vega and his whole gang by yourself?" It was a fair question. Santiago Vega usually rode with 6 or 7 men, all of them killers. Even for someone with Ethan's skills, those were long odds. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I can't just ride away knowing they're out there." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire they'd built in the shelter of the arroyo walls. The children were asleep nearby, curled together under a blanket salvaged from the ranch. "Among my people," she said finally, "when someone commits a great evil, it becomes everyone's responsibility to see justice done. Not because the law demands it, but because letting evil go unpunished poisons the whole community. So you think I should go after them?" "I think we should go after them," she corrected. "You saved my life, Ethan McGraw. Now it's time for me to help save others." The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. They would take the children north to Copper Creek, making sure they were safe with their uncle. Then they would track Vega's gang and find a way to stop them permanently. It wasn't a plan with good odds of success, but as Ethan looked at the sleeping children and thought about other families that might be in danger, he knew it was the right thing to do. The ride north to Copper Creek took them through some of the most desolate country in Arizona territory. Red mesas rose like ancient castles from the desert floor, and the heat was so intense that they traveled mostly at night, resting during the brutal midday sun. The children, whose names were Tommy and Little Beth, proved remarkably resilient. Tommy, the older boy, took his role as protector seriously, constantly watching over his sister and helping with camp chores without being asked. Beth, though still often silent and clinging, began to show glimpses of the spirited child she'd been before tragedy struck. "Uncle Jim will take care of us," Tommy assured his sister as they rode. "He's real strong, and he's got lots of horses." Copper Creek was larger than Dry Creek, but still small enough that strangers were immediately noticed. Uncle Jim turned out to be a barrel-chested man, with kind eyes and gentle hands, who broke down completely when he learned what had happened to his brother's family. "Course they'll stay with me," he said fiercely, gathering both children into his arms. "They're family. I'll raise them as my own." With the children safely placed, Ethan and Aiyana were free to pursue their real quarry. But first, they needed information. Santiago Vega and his gang wouldn't be easy to find in the vast desert, and tracking them blindly would be suicide. The local saloon proved to be a goldmine of information. The bartender, a former cavalry scout named Murphy, had been tracking outlaw movements for years and was happy to share what he knew with someone planning to do something about the problem. "Vega's been hitting ranches in a pattern," Murphy explained, spreading a hand-drawn map on the bar. "Started down near Tombstone, worked his way north. If he keeps following the pattern, next target would be the Morrison place, about 30 miles southeast of here." "How many men is he running with?" Ethan asked. "Last report had him with 6 or 7, all of them mean as snakes and twice as dangerous." Murphy studied Ethan carefully. "You sure you want to tangle with that bunch? They ain't your typical owl hoots. These boys kill for fun." "All the more reason to stop them," Aiyana said quietly. They reached the Morrison Ranch just as the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch was still intact, but Ethan's experienced eye immediately spotted signs of trouble. No smoke from the chimney, no horses in the corral, no dogs barking at their approach. "Too quiet," Aiyana whispered. They dismounted and approached on foot, weapons ready. The front door of the ranch house stood open, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Inside they found overturned furniture and signs of a struggle, but no bodies. "Blood here," Aiyana said, kneeling beside a dark stain on the wooden floor. "Not much. Maybe someone was wounded but got away." A search of the outbuildings revealed more signs of hasty departure. The barn was empty, but fresh horse droppings suggested animals had been kept there recently. Someone had left in a hurry, taking everything valuable they could carry. "Smart folks," Ethan observed, "must have gotten word about what happened to other ranches and decided not to wait around." But as they prepared to leave, Aiyana held up her hand for silence. "Horses," she whispered. "Coming this way." They took cover in the barn, watching through gaps in the weathered boards as 7 riders approached the ranch in the fading light. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the lead rider's silver-decorated sombrero and the distinctive scar on his cheek. Santiago Vega had arrived to find his prey already flown. "Maldición!" Vega's curse echoed across the empty ranch yard. "Where are they?" "Tracks lead north," one of his men reported after examining the ground around the house. "Looks like they pulled out maybe 2-3 days ago." "Cowards," another outlaw spat. "Running like rabbits." "Smart rabbits live longer than brave ones," Vega replied philosophically. "We'll make camp here tonight, head north in the morning. Sooner or later we'll find someone who didn't run." Ethan and Aiyana waited until the outlaws had settled in, around a fire in the ranch yard before making their move. The gang had posted no sentries, overconfident in their isolation and superior numbers. 7 against 2, Ethan whispered. Not the best odds. Then we make our own odds, Aiyana replied, her dark eyes gleaming with determination. The attack came at dawn, just as the outlaws were stirring around their dying campfire. Ethan had positioned himself in the hayloft of the barn, giving him a clear field of fire across the ranch yard. Aiyana had circled around to the back of the house, cutting off any escape route in that direction. Ethan's first shot took out the outlaw standing guard over their horses, dropping him silently before he could raise an alarm. His second shot shattered the coffee pot one of the men was reaching for, sending scalding liquid flying and causing the camp to erupt in chaos. "We're under attack!" someone screamed, and the outlaws scattered like startled quail, diving for whatever cover they could find. But Ethan and Aiyana had chosen their positions well. The ranch yard offered little protection, and the crossfire from the barn and house gave the outlaws nowhere to hide. Santiago Vega proved why he'd survived so long in a dangerous profession. Instead of panicking like his men, he immediately identified the threat and began organizing a counterattack. "Rodriguez, Sanchez, flank around to the barn," he shouted. "The rest of you, keep them pinned down." But Vega had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed he was facing a larger force, not just 2 determined individuals. When Rodriguez and Sanchez broke cover to rush the barn, they ran straight into Aiyana's rifle fire from the house. The battle was fierce but brief. Caught in a deadly crossfire with no effective cover, the outlaws fell one by one. Only Vega himself managed to reach his horse and attempt an escape, spurring the animal toward the open desert. Ethan burst from the barn and leaped onto Thunder's back, pursuing the fleeing outlaw across the rocky ground. Behind him, he could hear Aiyana following on her own mount. The chase stretched across miles of broken terrain, with Vega using every trick he knew to shake his pursuers. But Thunder was fresh, while Vega's horse had been ridden hard for weeks. And gradually Ethan began closing the distance. The end came at the edge of a deep canyon, where Vega's exhausted horse finally refused to jump a gap that might have carried them to safety. The outlaw turned at bay, his pistol raised, but Ethan was already in motion. The 2 men fired simultaneously. Vega's shot went wide, but Ethan's found its mark. Santiago Vega, scourge of the Arizona frontier, pitched backward off his horse and fell into the canyon. His reign of terror finally ended. They returned to Copper Creek 3 days later, leading a string of horses recovered from Vega's camp and carrying evidence of the gang's numerous crimes. Marshal Bradley was amazed by their success and grateful for the service they'd performed. "Territory's safer with that bunch gone," he said, counting out bounty money for the various wanted men they'd eliminated. "You two make quite a team." Tommy and little Beth were settling in well with their uncle, though they still showed signs of their ordeal. Both children brightened considerably when Ethan and Aiyana returned, rushing to embrace the 2 people who'd saved their lives. "Ah, you gonna stay?" Tommy asked hopefully. "Uncle Jim says you could work at the stable if you wanted." It was a tempting offer. Ethan found himself imagining a different kind of life, one with roots, responsibilities, and the companionship he'd rediscovered with Aiyana. But he could see the restlessness in her dark eyes, the pull of family and duty that called her south. "I need to find my people," she said that evening as they sat on the porch of the town's small boarding house. "They need to know what happened, and I need to know they're safe." "I understand," Ethan replied, though part of him wanted to ask her to stay. "Come with me," she said suddenly, turning to face him. "Help me find them. You said yourself you've been drifting too long." It was a decision that would change everything. Going with Aiyana meant abandoning the solitary life he'd known for years, opening himself up to connection and loss all over again. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he'd thought was gone forever, hope for a future that held more than just survival. "All right," he said quietly, "but I warn you I'm not much for farewell speeches." Her laughter was like music in the desert air. "Neither am I, Ethan McGraw. Neither am I." They left Copper Creek on a morning when the desert air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of rain on distant mountains. Their supplies were packed efficiently on 2 strong horses, and they carried letters of introduction from Marshal Bradley that might help them in their search. Aiyana had heard rumors that some of her people had taken refuge with relatives near the old Spanish mission of San Xavier del Bac, south of Tucson. It was a long journey through dangerous country, but she was determined to find them. "Tell me about your family," Ethan said, as they rode through a landscape of towering saguaro, cacti and scattered palo verde trees. "My father was a war chief, but he believed in peace with the whites when possible," she replied, her voice soft with memory. "My mother was a healer, like her mother before her. She taught me the old ways, which plants cure sickness, how to read the signs in nature, how to move silently through any terrain. Sounds like useful skills in this country. They kept me alive when Collins and his men attacked our camp," she said grimly. "I was gathering sacred plants in the hills when I saw the smoke. By the time I got back—" She trailed off, the pain still fresh despite the weeks that had passed. Ethan understood that kind of loss, the guilt that came from being absent when tragedy struck. "You couldn't have saved them," he said gently. "If you'd been there, you'd just be dead too." "I know that here," she replied, touching her head. "But knowing and feeling are different things." They traveled steadily south, avoiding the main trails, where possible, and keeping watch for signs of other travelers. The border country was lawless territory where Apache war parties, Mexican bandits, and American outlaws all operated with impunity. On their 3rd day, they encountered a group of Mexican vaqueros driving a small herd of cattle north. The cowboys were friendly enough, sharing their fire and trading information about trail conditions ahead. "See, we have heard of Apache bands near the old mission," their leader, a grizzled man named Esperanza, confirmed. "But be careful, amigos. There are also rurals in the area, Mexican soldiers who shoot first and ask questions later. They do not distinguish between peaceful Apache and warriors." The warning proved prescient. 2 days later, as they crested a ridge overlooking a green valley watered by a seasonal stream, they spotted a column of dust moving across the desert floor. Through Ethan's field glasses, they could make out uniformed riders. About 20 Mexican rurales heading north toward the border. "They're moving fast," Ethan observed, "either chasing something or running from it. Or hunting," Aiyana added grimly. "My people have learned to fear those gray uniforms as much as any Apache raiding party. They waited until the soldiers had passed before descending into the valley. The stream provided fresh water and a chance to rest their horses, but both riders remained alert. This close to the border, danger could come from any direction. That evening, as they camped in a hidden grove of cottonwoods near the stream, Aiyana shared more of her story. "When I was a child, the government tried to force our people onto reservations," she said, staring into their small fire. "Many went peacefully, believing the promises of food and protection, but the reservation was a place of death, bad water, poor soil, corrupt agents who sold our supplies to white merchants." "Your family left?" "My father led a group back to the mountains. We lived free for several years, hunting and gathering as our ancestors had done. But it couldn't last. The army came with more soldiers, better weapons. Some of our young men wanted to fight, but my father chose a different path. What did he do? He made a deal with a rancher named Morrison, an honest man who needed workers and wasn't afraid to hire Apache. We lived on his land, worked his cattle, and in return, he protected us from the soldiers. It worked for nearly 5 years. What happened? Aiyana's jaw tightened. Morrison died of a fever 2 winters ago. His son sold the ranch to a man who had no use for Apache workers. We were forced to leave, to scatter and find new places to hide. Ethan was beginning to understand the full scope of what Aiyana had lost. It wasn't just her immediate family killed by Collins. It was an entire way of life, a community that had found a brief moment of peace in a hostile world. The Spanish mission of San Xavier del Bac rose from the desert like a white jewel, its twin bell towers and ornate facade a stunning contrast to the harsh landscape surrounding it. Even from a distance, Ethan could see that the old church was still active. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and people moved among the buildings clustered around the main structure. "It's beautiful," Aiyana breathed, and Ethan could hear the hope in her voice. They approached carefully, aware that their arrival would be noted long before they reached the mission gates. A community like this survived by being cautious about strangers, especially in these troubled times. They were met by a Mexican priest, Father Miguel, whose weathered face spoke of decades spent ministering to the spiritual needs of both Mexican and Apache peoples. His eyes were kind but alert as he studied the unlikely pair before him. "Welcome, travelers," he said in accented English. "I am Father Miguel. How may I help you?" Aiyana stepped forward and spoke in rapid Spanish, explaining their mission. Ethan caught enough of the conversation to understand that she was asking about Apache refugees who might have sought sanctuary at the mission. The priest's expression grew thoughtful. "Come," he said finally. "There are people here you should meet." He led them through the mission courtyard, past workshops where skilled craftsmen were creating pottery and metalwork, to a small adobe building where several Apache families had made their temporary home. The reunion was emotional and complex. Some of the people recognized Aiyana immediately, embracing her with tears of joy and relief. Others were more cautious, having learned to be suspicious of anyone who arrived unannounced. But gradually, as Aiyana told her story and introduced Ethan as the man who had saved her life, the atmosphere warmed. Children who had been hiding behind their mothers' skirts came forward to stare curiously at the tall cowboy with the pale eyes. "Many of our people are scattered," explained an elderly woman named Maria, who seemed to be the informal leader of the refugees. "Some went north to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. Others crossed into Mexico, hoping to find relatives in the Sierra Madre Mountains." "And you?" Aiyana asked. "Why did you come here?" "Father Miguel offered us sanctuary," Maria replied. "Food, shelter, protection from those who would harm us. In return, we work, helping with the mission's farms and crafts, teaching the children, sharing our knowledge of desert survival." It was, Ethan realized, another attempt at the kind of peaceful coexistence that Aiyana's family had found with the rancher Morrison. A fragile arrangement that depended on the goodwill of individuals rather than the protection of laws. That evening, as they shared a meal with the mission community, Ethan found himself wondering what his own future held. The immediate goal of helping Aiyana find her people had been achieved, but where did that leave him? Father Miguel proved to be a fascinating conversationalist, well-educated and widely traveled, despite spending most of his adult life at the remote mission. Over dinner, he regaled them with stories of the region's history and the complex relationships between its various peoples. "The Apache are not one tribe, but many," he explained. "Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, each with their own territories and customs. The Americans tend to lump them all together, but they are as different from each other as Mexicans are from Americans." "Have you heard of any Chiricahua bands in the area?" Aiyana asked. Her own people were Chiricahua Apache, and she hoped to find relatives among the scattered groups. "There are rumors of a small band led by a war chief called Naiche hiding in the Dragoon Mountains," the priest replied. "But the area is heavily patrolled by both American cavalry and Mexican rurales. Very dangerous for anyone to venture there." After dinner, Ethan and Aiyana walked in the mission's garden, where fruit trees and vegetable plots flourished despite the desert climate. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of orange blossoms. "You could stay here," Ethan said quietly. "These people need you, and you'd be safe." Aiyana was silent for a long moment, considering his words. "Safety is precious," she agreed. "But it's not the same as freedom. And I still don't know what happened to my cousins, my aunts and uncles. They might be hiding in those mountains, needing help. The priest is right about the danger. Those mountains are crawling with soldiers." "I know." She turned to face him, her dark eyes serious in the moonlight. "Which is why I'm not asking you to come with me. You've already done more than enough. You could stay here too. Help Father Miguel with the mission work. He could use a man with your skills." It was a generous offer, and Ethan found himself genuinely tempted. The mission was a peaceful place, a refuge from the violence and uncertainty that had defined his life for so many years. He could imagine himself settling into a routine of simple work and quiet contemplation. But as he looked at Aiyana's face, he knew he couldn't let her go alone into those dangerous mountains. Somewhere along their journey together, she'd become more than just a traveling companion. She'd become someone worth risking everything for. "I reckon I've gotten used to your company," he said with a slight smile. "Besides, someone needs to keep you out of trouble." Her answering smile was radiant. "Are you sure? The Dragoon Mountains are no place for a reformed drifter." "A good thing I'm not reformed yet," Ethan replied. "Still got some rough edges that might come in handy." They left the mission before dawn 3 days later, loaded with supplies and carrying Father Miguel's blessing. The priest had provided them with a detailed map of the Dragoon Mountains and information about water sources and hidden trails known only to the Apache. "Be very careful, my children," he said as they prepared to depart. "The mountains have claimed many lives in recent years. Do not let pride overcome prudence." The dragoons rose from the desert floor like the spine of some prehistoric monster, their rocky peaks and deep canyons creating a natural fortress. It was easy to see why Apache war chiefs had chosen this area for their strongholds. A small force of determined fighters could hold off a much larger army in terrain like this. But the same features that made the mountains a refuge also made them a trap. There were only a few ways in or out, and all of them were watched by patrols of soldiers. "We'll have to go in at night," Ethan decided after studying the approaches through his field glasses. Too much open ground to cross during daylight. They spent the day hidden in a grove of mesquite trees, resting and preparing for the dangerous journey ahead. As evening approached, Aiyana performed a brief ceremony, burning sage and speaking words in her native language that Ethan didn't understand, but found strangely comforting. "Asking the spirits for protection," she explained when she noticed his curiosity. "Think they'll listen? They've kept us alive this long," she replied with a small smile. The night approach proved even more treacherous than they'd anticipated. Loose rock made every step dangerous in the darkness, and they had to lead their horses up slopes so steep that one misstep could send rider and animal tumbling into unseen depths. But Aiyana's knowledge of Apache trailcraft served them well. She seemed to have an instinctive feel for the landscape, finding paths that Ethan's eyes couldn't detect and guiding them safely through obstacles that would have stopped a less skilled tracker. By dawn, they were deep in the mountains, following a narrow canyon that twisted between towering walls of red sandstone. The air was cooler here, and occasional springs provided fresh water and patches of green vegetation. "Someone's been here recently," Aiyana observed, kneeling to examine tracks in the sandy canyon floor. Unshod horses, moving carefully. Apache, ponies. How recent? 2 days, maybe 3, heading deeper into the mountains. They followed the trail carefully, alert for signs of both the Apache they sought and the soldiers who might be hunting them. The canyon branched and twisted, creating a maze that would be nearly impossible to navigate without a guide. It was mid-afternoon when they heard the sound that froze their blood, the distant crack of rifle fire echoing off the canyon walls. The gunfire was coming from somewhere ahead of them, the sharp reports magnified and distorted by the canyon walls until it was impossible to determine the exact location. Ethan and Aiyana dismounted and moved forward on foot, leaving their horses hidden among some boulders. The canyon opened into a natural amphitheater, its walls rising hundreds of feet on all sides, like the columns of some ancient cathedral. At the far end, partially concealed by fallen rocks and scraggly pine trees, they could see the muzzle flashes of rifles. "There," Aiyana whispered, pointing to a ledge about halfway up the opposite wall. "Apache fighters, maybe 6 or 8 of them." Below, scattered among the boulders on the canyon floor, Ethan could make out the blue uniforms of U.S. cavalry soldiers. A troop of perhaps 20 men had the Apache position surrounded, but couldn't get close enough to finish the fight due to the defenders' superior position. "We need to get closer," Ethan said. "Can't tell what's happening from here." They worked their way around the amphitheater's edge, using every bit of available cover to avoid being spotted by either side. As they got nearer, they could hear voices, orders being shouted in English, defiant calls in Apache. From their new position, Ethan could see the situation more clearly. The Apache were indeed trapped on the ledge, but they had good cover and plenty of ammunition. The soldiers had them pinned down, but couldn't advance without suffering heavy casualties. "It's a standoff," he murmured to Aiyana. "Could go on for hours, or until one side runs out of bullets." "Those are my people up there," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. "I can see my cousin dancing fox, and there's old Chief Naiche himself." "The war chief Father Miguel mentioned?" "Yes. If he's here, then this is probably the last free band of Chiricahua in Arizona. They're fighting for more than just their lives. They're fighting for their entire way of existence." As if to underscore her words, a bugle call echoed from the canyon entrance. Reinforcements were coming, more cavalry troops that would tip the balance decisively against the trapped Apache. "We have to do something," Aiyana said desperately. Ethan studied the tactical situation with the eye of a man who'd survived more than his share of gunfights. The Apache position was strong defensively, but they had no way to retreat. The soldiers controlled all the escape routes and had the numbers to eventually overwhelm the defenders. "There might be a way," he said slowly, "but it's going to be dangerous. Tell me." "Those soldiers are focused on the ledge, expecting the Apache to either surrender or fight to the death. They're not watching their backs. If we could circle around, create a distraction from behind, the Apache could escape in the confusion," Aiyana finished. "But 2 of us against 20 soldiers." "We don't have to beat them," Ethan explained. "Just confuse them long enough for your people to get away." It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but as the sound of approaching reinforcements grew louder, they both knew it was their only option. Ethan and Aiyana split up, circling the amphitheater in opposite directions to maximize the confusion their attack would create. The plan was simple. At Ethan's signal, a specific bird call that Aiyana had taught him, they would open fire on the soldiers from behind, drawing their attention away from the Apache position long enough for the trapped warriors to escape. Moving through the broken terrain at the canyon's edge, Ethan was reminded of his younger days as a cavalry scout. He'd learned to move silently through enemy territory, to read the land and use it to his advantage. Those skills, rusty from years of disuse, came flooding back as he worked his way into position. From his hiding place behind a massive boulder, he could see the cavalry troop spread out among the rocks below. The soldiers were experienced Indian fighters, their positions well chosen and their discipline good. But they were all facing the wrong direction. The reinforcements, another troop of cavalry, had just entered the canyon when Ethan gave the signal. His rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times, each shot carefully aimed and deadly accurate. Across the amphitheater, he could hear Aiyana's weapon adding its voice to the sudden chaos. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who had been calmly besieging the Apache position suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Shouts of alarm and confusion echoed off the canyon walls as officers tried to reorganize their forces. From the ledge, above, Chief Naiche and his warriors didn't waste the opportunity. With war cries that seemed to shake the very stones, they launched themselves down from their position, using ropes and handholds that only they knew existed to descend the seemingly impossible cliff face. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire, shouting and desperate movement. Ethan continued to fire from his concealed position, targeting officers and non-commissioned officers in an effort to disrupt the soldiers' chain of command. Across the way, Aiyana's rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully placed to maximum effect. But they were vastly outnumbered, and it was only a matter of time before the soldiers recovered from their initial surprise. Already, Ethan could see blue-uniformed figures working their way toward his position, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance. "Time to go," he muttered to himself, falling back from his first position to a secondary hiding place he'd already scouted. The Apache, meanwhile, had reached the canyon floor and were fighting their way toward the narrow exit that led deeper into the mountains. Chief Naiche, despite his advanced age, moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his rifle and war hatchet taking a terrible toll on any soldier who tried to block his path. Young Dancing Fox, whom Aiyana had pointed out earlier, proved to be every bit as formidable as his chief. The young warrior seemed to be everywhere at once, covering his companion's retreat, while somehow avoiding the bullets that filled the air around him. But the escape was taking too long. The reinforcing cavalry troop had recovered from the initial shock and was moving to block the canyon exit. If the Apache didn't break through soon, they would be trapped again, this time without the advantage of high ground. That was when Aiyana did something that took Ethan's breath away. Rising from her concealed position, she stepped into full view of both sides and shouted something in Apache. Her voice carried clearly across the amphitheater, and its effect on the warriors was electric. With renewed fury, the Apache fighters surged forward, breaking through the cavalry line in a desperate final push. Chief Naiche grabbed Aiyana's arm as they passed her position, pulling her along with them toward the safety of the deeper canyons. Ethan found himself alone, surrounded by angry soldiers who had just watched their quarry escape. It was time for some fancy shooting and faster running. The chase through the twisting canyons lasted most of the night. Ethan used every trick he'd learned in his years on the frontier, doubling back on his own trail, using water to conceal his scent, even climbing impossible cliff faces to throw off his pursuers. By dawn, he had finally lost the last of the cavalry patrols and found himself alone in a hidden valley deep in the heart of the Dragoon Mountains. A small stream provided fresh water, and ancient petroglyphs on the canyon walls suggested this place had been sacred to the Apache for generations. It was there that Aiyana found him, appearing silently from the morning shadows like a ghost made flesh. "I was beginning to worry," she said, but her smile showed her relief at finding him safe. "Takes more than a few cavalry troops to put me down," Ethan replied, though privately he admitted he'd had some close calls during the night chase. "Others are camped nearby," she told him. "Chief Naiche wants to thank you personally for what you did." The Apache camp was hidden in a grove of ancient oaks, their massive trunks providing both shelter and concealment. Despite having just fought a running battle with the U.S. Army, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration rather than despair. Chief Naiche proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, his weathered face marked by decades of war and hardship. But his dark eyes were still sharp and intelligent, and when he looked at Ethan, there was both gratitude and assessment in his gaze. "You are the white man who saved my niece," he said in careful English, "and who helped us escape the blue coats. Why?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Ethan thought for a moment before responding. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because Aiyana has taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are long." The old chief nodded slowly, as if Ethan's answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "You have the heart of a warrior, but not the hatred that usually comes with it. This is rare." "What will you do now?" Ethan asked. "The army will keep hunting you. For now, we will go deeper into the mountains, to places the soldiers fear to follow," Nietzsche replied. "But you are right. They will never stop hunting us as long as we remain free. Eventually, we will have to choose between death and surrender." It was a stark assessment, but Ethan could see the truth in it. The Apache way of life was ending, ground down between the advancing tide of American settlement and the inexorable power of the federal government. But for now, in this hidden valley, they were still free. And sometimes, Ethan reflected, freedom, even temporary freedom, was worth any price. They stayed with Chief Nietzsche's band for a week, during which time Ethan learned more about Apache culture and customs than he had in all his previous years on the frontier. Despite their desperate situation, the people maintained their dignity and their traditions, teaching their children the old ways, even as the world around them changed irrevocably. Aiyana was clearly happy to be reunited with her extended family, but Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. She had found what she was looking for, surviving relatives who could carry on her family's memory, but she had also found a community living on borrowed time. "They want me to stay," she told him one evening, as they sat beside the stream that ran through the hidden valley. "Chief Nietzsche says I could marry Dancing Fox, help rebuild our numbers." Ethan felt something twist in his chest at her words, a pain he hadn't expected. Somewhere during their long journey together, Aiyana had become more than just a companion. She had become essential to his vision of the future. "He's a good man," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Young, strong, a proven warrior." "Yes," she agreed, "everything an Apache woman should want in a husband." But she was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. "But he's not you," she said finally. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Ethan felt his heart hammering in his chest as he realized that everything he'd thought he understood about his life was about to change. "Aiyana," he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "I know what you're going to say," she told him. "That we're from different worlds, that it could never work between us. And maybe you're right, but I also know that I'd rather face an uncertain future with you than a safe one without you." Ethan looked at her face in the moonlight, seeing the intelligence and strength that had first attracted him, but also something new, vulnerability and hope that matched his own. "Where would we go?" he asked. "Your people need you here, and I'm a wanted man in half the territories." "Father Miguel offered us sanctuary at the mission," she reminded him. "We could start over there, help him with his work. It wouldn't be the life either of us was born to, but it would be our life." It was a leap of faith that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. But as Ethan looked around the hidden valley, where proud people clung to the last remnants of their freedom, he realized that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in fighting impossible odds. It was in choosing to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. Chief Nietzsche took the news of their decision with the stoic acceptance of a man who had watched his entire world disappear piece by piece. But Ethan could see the pain in the old warrior's eyes as he realized he was losing another piece of his people's future. "You are sure this is what you want?" he asked Aiyana in Apache, though Ethan had learned enough of the language to follow the conversation. "I am sure, uncle," she replied with quiet dignity. "My heart has chosen its path. And you, white man?" Nature turned to Ethan. "Are you prepared for the difficulties you will face? There are many who will not accept your union." "We'll face them together," Ethan replied simply. The chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have proven your worth in battle and your loyalty in friendship. If Aiyana chooses you, then you have my blessing." They prepared to leave the hidden valley the next morning, taking with them supplies for the journey back to the mission and carrying letters from the Apache band to relatives who might be living on reservations or in Mexico. Dancing Fox, who had clearly hoped to court Aiyana himself, proved to be gracious in defeat. "Take care of her," he told Ethan in halting English. "She is precious to all of us." "I will," Ethan promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The farewell was emotional but brief. These people had learned that long goodbyes only made separation harder, and they had endured too many partings already. As they rode out of the valley, Ethan turned back for one last look at the Apache camp. Chief Nietzsche stood at the edge of the tree line, a solitary figure silhouetted against the morning sky. The old warrior raised his hand in a final salute, and Ethan returned the gesture with deep respect. He knew he was witnessing the end of an era, the last chapter in a story that had begun centuries ago when the first Apache ancestors had migrated into this harsh but beautiful land. Soon, very soon, men like Nietzsche would be gone forever, and with them would go a way of life that had once defined the American Southwest. But endings, Ethan reflected as they rode toward their new future, also meant beginnings. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to choose what your new beginning looked like. Udbrass Epilogue. New dawn 6 months later. Ethan McGraw stood in the courtyard of San Xavier del Bac, watching his wife teach a group of Mexican and Apache children how to identify medicinal plants in the mission garden. The sight never failed to fill him with wonder, not just at Aiyana's knowledge and patience, but at the simple miracle of their life together. Their wedding had been a unique affair, blessed by Father Miguel according to Catholic tradition, but also incorporating Apache customs that honored Aiyana's heritage. The mission community had embraced them both, grateful for Ethan's skills as a craftsman and security advisor, and for Aiyana's expertise in desert survival and traditional healing. Life wasn't without its challenges. Some of the nearby townspeople remained suspicious of their mixed marriage, and there were occasional tensions with both civil and military authorities. But they had each other, and they had found a community that valued their contributions more than it questioned their backgrounds. Word occasionally reached them from the outside world. Chief Nietzsche and his band had finally surrendered to General Miles, ending the last chapter of the Apache Wars. The old warrior and his people had been loaded onto trains and shipped to a prison camp in Florida, far from the desert homeland they had fought so hard to protect. The news saddened them both, but it also reinforced their conviction that they had made the right choice. They were building something new and hopeful in a world that too often seemed determined to tear things down. "What are you thinking about?" Aiyana asked, joining him as the children ran off to play in the mission courtyard. "Just watching you." "Work," Ethan replied, slipping his arm around her waist. "Still amazes me sometimes how much you know about healing. My mother always said that the greatest medicine wasn't in the plants themselves, but in the love with which they were given," she said, leaning into his embrace. "I think she would have liked you. Think she would have approved of your choice." "I know she would have," Aiyana said with certainty. "She always told me to follow my heart, no matter where it led." As the sun set over the desert, painting the mission walls gold and crimson, Ethan found himself thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. He had been a drifter for so many years, a man without roots or real purpose, running from a past he couldn't change. But Sometimes, if you were very fortunate, running could bring you to exactly where you needed to be. And sometimes, the person you saved ended up saving you right back. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the desert, and the sound seemed to carry with it all the wild beauty and dangerous hope of the American frontier. It was a hard land that demanded everything from those who chose to make their home in it, but for those with the courage to stay and build, it offered rewards beyond measure. Ethan McGraw had finally stopped drifting, and in finding his place in the world, he had discovered that some journeys were worth every mile, every hardship, every risk along the way. The desert had tested him, tried him, and ultimately accepted him. And in its vast, unforgiving embrace, he had found not just love, but home.